All right, so welcome to the Murray Amateur Radio Club. I'm Jan, KD7ZWV. I'm the club vice president, and we do record these and put them up on the website. I will put the recording and the slides up on the website, so for your later perusal. So if you're paying attention and you see a link on the screen, you don't have to whip your phone out and take a photo of it. It will be online on the website afterwards.
Battalion 41, Medic Ladder 117.
Oh boy.
Respond to track fire. At 30.
This is the only drawback of meeting at the fire department,
Fire 2.
is we get to hear all the fire calls. So
Respond to track fire. At 33.
Wow.
South I-15 northbound freeway.
They're calling them out.
Time on 1839.
All right. Okay. We'll give them a minute.
They do take priority.
They're very important and we appreciate them very much. And we couldn't do this without our support from Murray City. So we definitely appreciate them. All right. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is language, jargon, and how to talk on the radio. Now, this is part of what we're calling our Back to Basics series this year. Last year, we did a Getting Started with Amateur Radio series that seemed to be fairly well received, but we had some people come back and say, hey, we're concerned because we don't remember all the things we learned, or I've had my license for a while and I've never used it, in that kind of situation. So in order to work around this problem, we're going to go ahead and go back to the basics. And last month we talked about VHF and UHF and how they differ and how they're the same and things along those lines. Well, today we're going to talk about the things that you might hear on the radio, the things that you might say or want to say on the radio, and how to talk on the radio. So we're going to jump right into it. If I can click on the button. There we go. Okay, so every technology has its own language or jargon. I'm a computer guy, and we talk about servers, and we talk about containers and Helm charts and all kinds of crazy stuff. And those are parts of the language and jargon that we use in my profession. I know my daughter's a nurse, and she talks about things like patient's BP and their vitals and all of these other code letters and words and stuff. And that's her jargon for her job. Well, amateur radio is no different. It has its own language or its own jargon. And we use particular terms when we're talking about radios, as well as when we're talking on the radio. And we do this for a few reasons. One is because it makes us sound cool. No, that's not the reason. No, the main reason is for clarity and to understand what we're talking about. We want to keep our transmissions short. The radio waves are a finite resource. And when you're talking, no one else can talk. So you want to keep your transmissions as short as possible, especially in an emergency situation or something like that, where, things are going bad. Lots of people have something that needs to get said. Things need to get communicated. And we need to do that rapidly and safely and coordinated. And we also do it for ease of communicating. So there are certain things that we will use, certain pieces of language and terms and things that we will use because they are easier to understand on the radio. Okay. So let's start with some common terms that you will hear relating to amateur radio. And as you get more familiar with these, you will use these terms as well. So the first one is an HT. Everybody will talk about, well, my HT did this the other day, or I forgot my HT, I left it in the suitcase or whatever. And what they're talking about is their handy-talkie radio. It's a handheld radio. Now, a lot of people used to call these walkie-talkies. I know when I was a kid, I had a walkie-talkie, and it was a box about yay big with a pull-out antenna on it, right? A telescoping antenna on it, and it actually worked on Citizens Band Channel 14. And I could talk on that thing a good 2 blocks, with other people, and it was pretty awesome when I was 12, So it's not really a walkie-talkie. The term walkie-talkie came from the military, and it was the big backpack unit that the radio operator who is deployed with a particular platoon or whatever would carry around on his back. And that was a walkie-talkie because he could walk and talk at the same time. Okay. We call a handheld radio a handy-talkie because it's much handier than a walkie-talkie. Okay. You can hold it in your hand for starters, hence handy-talkie, right? Dan, you have a comment?
I was just gonna say that the military radio unit on the back was also called a target.
Yes. Dan's comment is that the radio that the soldier was carrying on his back also turned you into a target because the enemy would see you with the radio and know that if they could take you out, maybe you wouldn't be able to make a radio call and call in an airstrike or artillery or something like that on them. So it was not always the best position to have as the radio operator when you were deployed somewhere.
Ended up in Durham, old prick.
Well, that was a specific type of radio that its actual designation was PRC.
Yep.
And so that's where that,
Still,
yes, yeah. So the mobile radio, on the other hand,
Justin has a,
oh, their question?
You know, I always thought HT was handheld transceiver. Is it both?
I guess you could call it that if you want. I've always heard it called handy talkie. So
I
Really?
first heard it as handheld transceiver for HD.
really,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah, I
that's,
never heard handy talkie. This was the first time. I guess it kind of works for both, huh?
I've never heard it called the handheld transceiver, but that certainly makes sense.
Interesting.
It
Interesting.
definitely makes sense for that to be a cross corresponding definition of the term. So we'll use both in the future. So a mobile radio is a radio that's mounted in a vehicle. So that's really its only distinguishing characteristic is that it's in a vehicle and vehicles can move. So it's a mobile radio. The corollary to that, of course, is the base radio, which is a radio that's used in a fixed location. Now, you may find that the exact same radio can be used as a mobile or as a base. And in fact, your handy-talkie could be used as a mobile or as a base, depending on how you have it hooked up and what you're doing with it. So the definitions are a little loose, but those are typically the terms that we're going to use is a base is a radio that is at a fixed location. It doesn't move around. A mobile is in a vehicle or in some other portable fashion where it can move around. And a handy-talkie or an HT is a handheld radio, okay? The next one that you will hear is license class. People will talk about their license class. And there are 5 active license classes in the US right now. Other countries have their own rules and regulations, and so they have different names for their license classes. They have similar requirements, but they're not exactly, they don't match one-to-one necessarily with the US requirements. We're going to talk mainly about the US ones here, and those are novice, technician or tech, general, advanced, and extra or amateur extra if you want to give it the full name. The difference between these relates to the privileges that the operator has and the knowledge that the operator has displayed that they have through taking a test that permitted them to get that class of license, okay? So you might be saying, wait, there's 5, there were only 3 tests. So why are there 5 license classes? Well, novice and advanced are old license classes from years ago. And you can't actually get a new novice license today or a new advanced license today. If you happen to have had a novice license from before and you continue to renew it every 10 years like you're supposed to, you may still have a novice license and still only be able to operate with novice privileges. Same thing goes for advanced. Nowadays, of course, the entry-level license is the technician license, and that basically gives you pretty much full access to any of the VHF and higher bands. You can pretty much do anything you want on those bands that is illegal on those bands. It also gives you some privileges on 10 meters, 40 meters, and 80 meters on the HF bands. You can't do voice, for example, on 40 and 80, but you can do code, Morse code.
6 also.
6 also, but 6 is in the VHF range. So, 6, you have full privileges on, right? So 6 to 1.25 meters, 70 centimeters, microwave, all that other stuff. Technicians can do any of that stuff.
Matter of fact, you'll see the 6 meter on a number of HT models.
Some HTs do 6 meters. Yeah. I just can't picture the full antenna, the full wave antenna on a handheld, but okay, well, I don't know. Sorry. General class would be the next one, and that gives you access to the HF bands, full access where you can do voice, you can do digital, you can do whatever you want on those bands, but on subsets of those bands. So like you can't use the full 80-meter band, for example. There's only a portion of it that you're allowed to use as a general. And some of the other bands have similar restrictions. Extra basically gives you access to everything. You have full access to all of the amateur radio bands and any modes or anything that you want to do on those bands. So the hard part is, and I call it the hard part, it's not really that hard, but you have to take one test for technician, and for general, you have to either take both the technician test and the general test and pass them, or you have to already have your technician and take the general test. And for the extra, there's a third test, and you have to pass all three of the tests or already have the general when you get your extra. So I know, Chris, you're planning to upgrade, right? So yeah, I hate it when that happens. See, I never even took the test because I hadn't studied it at all. I had only studied for the technician, and I'm still a technician. Okay. And I found that, a lot of people say, well, you're not really in ham radio unless you're doing HF. And I'm like, want to bet? I mean, I'm doing all kinds of ham radio stuff, and I'm a technician, and I'm active on VHF, I'm active on UHF, I'm active on microwave. I'm doing all kinds of stuff. I teach classes, I come to my club meetings, I'm super active. And I'm not a general or an extra. I would like to get my general at some point, and I have some books that I'm working through and studying. But man, my brain's not as plastic as it used to be. And so it's hard. There are certain things that you have to memorize, and those things are hard to get plugged into my brain at my advanced age, he
As
says.
a matter of fact, there's a commandment in the Murray Amateur Radio Club's bylaws that says, thou shalt not say, I am just a technician. That is a no-no. Because with the technician, it's amazing the things that you can.
You can do a lot of stuff as a
Yeah.
technician, and you should never feel like, oh, I only have a technician license, so I'm not a real ham, right? No, you can do so much with technician. There is plenty of things for you to do that will occupy you for years or decades in my
Your
case,
entire lifetime.
easily. And you will still be doing and learning new things and encountering new capabilities that you can operate in. So don't ever feel like if you have your technician license, you have to get your general or people will look down on you. Some people will look down on you, but some people will look down on you no matter what you do. Some people will look down on you because you don't have to learn Morse code anymore, right? So, that's the no code extras have a designation that some people just sneer at, and I've never understood that. Why do people have to act that way? Why do they feel like they need to be superior? I have no idea. But we don't do that around here. Murray Amateur Radio Club, we're very academic in that regard. We would love to have you have your general or your extra, but if you have your technician, we are very happy that you have your technician. Okay.
One thing, if I can throw something in.
Yeah.
With the Army, I was once sent back to Fort Bragg and training for the Special Forces course out there to decide what should we continue to teach for the next few years and what should we discontinue. They wanted to discontinue. Scream, no, you gotta have, nothing else builds with Morse code always gets through.
Right.
Then they asked the question, when's the last time you used it?
The last World War.
Right.
I had
What, you
used
had
it
to?
in the previous few years, but the people I was sending to had to record it on a little tape recorder.
And then
Play
decode
at
it.
slow speed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah.
To saying, so even though I had recently used it, there was nobody I could send it to, and so the value of Morse code You know, those and code extras are operating just like the code extras, so.
Yeah.
Well, I've trained radio operators, Fort Jackson, some. It's all on top. I saw one of the more guys, you know, after 8 hours of it, he just jumped up and ran out screaming and never saw. That's training, that's good. Everybody taught CW, but they put me there after 60 minutes, CW.
Yeah.
All the give up on it.
So some of the comments from the group here for you guys on the Zoom and on the recording, there were notes that the Army was investigating the opportunity of discontinuing teaching Morse code to radio operators. And all of the radio operators that they called in to ask about that said, no, we must have Morse code. If all else fails, Morse code will get through. And the next question was, when was the last time you used it? And there was a lot of silence. And so other comments have indicated that, yeah, they don't really teach Morse code anymore in the military. They still do in some aspects, I'm sure. Some ratings or some MOSs probably still call for it, but I know like in aviation, VORs identify themselves by Morse code. So it's kind of useful to at least know some of the letters when you're out flying. So, but you know, it's one of those technologies that is its own special thing. And Stan, go ahead.
I'm gonna say, amateur extra class, you get to choose your own call sign. If it's available. I know I chose mine.
Yeah.
My initial.
Is that still the case, or do you have to get a vanity call now? Okay.
You can do that with any of them.
Yeah, you can get a vanity call, right?
When it becomes available, you can request it. And they can decide whether or not to give it to you.
Well, the amateur extra class, they just have, you know, typically only 4 letters and numbers.
Right.
Mine's a little longer, right? Initials.
Yeah. All right.
I
So
have a comment.
yeah, go ahead, Ragnar.
When I got my license, I tested for the novice and technician plus. So my first license was technician plus, and that was Morse code. You had to pass Morse code to get the technician plus. So I just thought I'd add old history to this
Yeah.
comment.
Yeah, they did. They used to have that Tech Plus license category as well. That was when they first said that technicians did not have to have Morse. But if you had the Morse, if you passed the Morse test, you could be a tech, what they call the Tech Plus. And I don't even remember if it gave you any additional privileges. I'm sure it gave you some somewhere, but yeah, it's one of those cases
Yeah,
though.
you're not talking on 80 and 40.
Right, with CW, right? Exactly. Yeah. So, all right, let's move on. All right, so modulation or modes, you'll hear people talk about modes and you'll hear people talk about modulation. And these are some of the modes that you'll hear about or the modulations that you hear about. You'll hear about FM, which is frequency modulation. And so what this means is the signal. Oh my, just a second, folks.
South Highland Drive. Respond on type fire 2, near 1750 East, medic engine 104, and medic ambulance 81. Respond to chest pain.
We're getting it for the ambulance. So apparently they didn't send the ambulance to the truck fire, just the engine. So now they're sending the ambulance out. Yep. Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. So the information or the signal is overlaid on the frequency, which changes as the transmission happens. So if you think about like FM radio in your car, the way that works is it's using a chunk of the band and it's adjusting the frequency of the signal to carry the information. So your radio is tuned to a specific frequency, and it can tell how much off that frequency the actual signal is. And that tells it uses that to decode what the information signal is. And the information would typically be your voice or some digital data. Amplitude modulation is a similar thing. It's modulating that wave, but instead of the frequency changing, the amount of power in the wave goes up and down in line with the signal. So it's the amplitude of the wave, or think of it as the height or the energy in the wave. Okay, the amount of energy in the wave. Single sideband is similar to AM in that it uses that amplitude modulation. But if you ever looked at a AM signal, you would see a carrier wave on the particular frequency, and then you would see some lobes of data on either side of it, a little bit above the frequency, a little bit below the frequency. And so what single sideband does is it suppresses the carrier and one of those lobes and leaves just the other lobe. The information is the same on both sides of the signal. So whether you're upper sideband or lower sideband, either one of those will carry the signal. The reason that you do that is for the same amount of power that you're putting into the signal, you basically get 4 times as much power out because you're not putting any on the carrier and you're not putting any on that other lobe that you're not using. Okay. So that's why we use single sideband. It's a lot more efficient. Plus, it uses half as much of the bandwidth of the frequency band. So it gives you that much more places where you can operate. Dan, go ahead.
So if you're buying a shortwave radio for just receive only, you want to make sure that you buy the shortwave radio that has that's SSB capable.
Yes.
That way you'll be able to listen to the ham radio operators.
Yes. And
DMR, right?
No, this is just regular shortwave radio that you get on Amazon or something. You have to make sure that it says it'll do single sideband SSB. Otherwise, it just does the AM. So, and you can.
if you guys ever used CB radios back in the day, you could set your CB radio for upper sideband or lower sideband or regular AM. And if you were on AM and somebody was on single sideband, it would sound like you'd only hear
You can hear
some of it, but it would be, you can't quite make out what they're actually saying. And so you would need a radio that had single sideband capability. And so what Dan is saying is if you're buying a receiver only radio to listen to shortwave broadcasts, get one that does have single sideband capability, and then you'll be able to listen to amateur radio operators as well, not just like the BBC or whatever. Russ.
One of the early shortwave radios that I had actually had a dial. And you could tone it to the middle and you get both bands or both sides. But if you turned it down, you get lower, turn it up, you get upper. So you could actually get.
So you could decide how much
Yeah.
split you wanted between the two bands,
Yeah.
or between the upper sideband and the lower sideband. That's interesting. You could adjust the bias basically.
It was a radio. Yeah.
Radio Shack. Somehow that doesn't surprise me. Stan.
Say on FM, I was explained that the distance it moves from center frequency is determined by the loudness. How fast it moves from center frequency back and forth is determined by the frequency.
Okay. That's a good description. So as Stan explains on FM, the distance from the center point of the frequency is the loudness of the signal, or the information for the signal, and then the speed with which it moves carries the frequency, right, of the audio. So the distance is the volume, the speed of the change of distance is the audio signal.
It's limited to 15 kilohertz in commercial FM, and for us, even less than that.
Yeah. All right, so the last one I have is CW, or continuous wave, and that is basically your radio is either transmitting or it's not transmitting, right? So you have pulses of information that are being sent out, and every time you're transmitting, that is part of the signal. And when you're not transmitting, that's part of the gap between signals. And depending on how long the pulse is in time, that determines if it's a dot or a dash. A dash is 3 times as long as a dot. And when you're keying out a word, the space between letters in a word is as long as a dot, and the spaces between words is as long as a dash. So if you're doing it correctly, which the cool thing about the brain and the ear is that it doesn't have to be done perfectly for you to be able to read it and understand it. But if you are doing it correctly, it will be timed out precisely. And if you're using a mechanical keyer with paddles or something like that, it will be timed correctly because that device will ensure that it is. Other terms that you'll hear are wavelength and frequency, and we've been throwing those around for the last 5 minutes. But what they basically mean is if you look at your electromagnetic wave traveling through space, it's traveling at the speed of light, okay? Whatever the speed of light is at the particular medium that it's going through, whether that's air or vacuum or whatever. And as it's flying along, you can think of it as moving up and down like a wave would move, like if you're moving a slinky, right? If you're waving your slinky back and forth and you have this kind of sine wave shape to it, okay? If you look at that, there's a couple of factors there. If you're looking at a particular point and you're counting the number of peaks that go by, that gives you your frequency. If you count like in 1 second, how many peaks go by, that gives you your frequency. And the distance between the peaks is your wavelength, okay? And the distance between the peaks is the same as the difference between the troughs, right? So as you're watching this wave go by, that's how you tell the difference between the wavelength and the frequency. And when we're talking about amateur radio, typically with your VHF radio, we're talking about 144 megahertz or millions, 144 million times the peak goes past every second, right? So 144 million peaks go by every second at a particular point. And the wavelength is about 2 meters. And the corresponding factor between the wavelength and the frequency, if you multiply the wavelength and the frequency together, you get the speed of light in meters per second. So that's always the ratio. It's always the same ratio, okay? So if somebody says, well, the frequency is 144.5, what's the wavelength? Speed of light divided by the frequency gives you the wavelength, and vice versa. If it's 2 meters, the speed of light divided by 2 meters gives you the frequency. So
times 10^6 divided by the frequency.
exactly. Speed of light is about 300 million meters per second. So that's easy to calculate that. Even easier because you don't have to calculate the millions. You just say 300 divided by the wavelength gives you the frequency in megahertz. So that's the relationship between wavelength and frequency. Okay, so digital modes are another type of mode that you'll hear about a lot. There's digital voice. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about systems like DMR, D-Star. I don't know, did I spell Yaesu correctly, Dan? You're the Yaesu guy.
No.
I spelled it wrong. I thought I probably was spelling it wrong. Yaesu System Fusion, or you'll hear it called YSF. P25 is the same system that public service radios will use. Public service radios are moving to do encryption on that, and we can't do encryption on amateur radio. So don't be surprised if there's a flood of PS25, P25 type radios hitting the market as the various departments switch over to the new system and get new radios for everything. So we may find more people trying to play around with P25. It should be kind of fun. Free DV, NXDN, and M17 are other mechanisms that are used for this digital voice. And basically, your voice is converted into a digital signal, and then that digital signal is encoded onto the analog radio signal and sent out. And then on the other side, it's decoded and converted back into an audio signal. Dan, you had a comment.
Yeah, just want to let you know that there are P25 repeaters out there.
There are
So
P25
if
repeaters.
you do have a P25 radio, you can still talk ham.
Yep. Packet radio is another digital mode that you'll hear about. APRS uses the same mechanisms that packet radio uses. It doesn't use the same the same organization of the data, right? In packet radio, every packet has a source and a destination. And those source and destination are call signs. And so when a packet goes out on packet radio, it moseys its way through the packet network until it gets to its destination. With APRS, it uses kind of a flood fill algorithm. And so the source is your call sign, but the destination is usually some special code that says what kind of radio you've got. And so it just floods out to everybody with APRS, but it uses the same underlying protocol as packet radio. You'll also find image modes like amateur television, which is actual high speed, full speed television, like an actual live television signal on amateur frequencies. Slow scan TV, which is basically single images that paint out a line at a time and then moves on to the next image. Every now and then the space station, the ISS, will do a slow scan TV bunch where they will start sending 16 different slow scan images one after another. And it's kind of an adventure to try to capture those and receive those and get those pictures from the space station. And then you can also do facsimile, which is just like your old fax machine, but it's done on radio instead of on a phone line. RTTY is radio teletype. So if you've ever used a TDD, it's a telephone device for the deaf, that basically does the same thing as RTTY, but it does it over the phone system. It essentially converts what you type into a 5-bit code that gets sent out over the radio, and then the receiver receives that code and displays it or prints it out on a printer or on a screen. So people still do this, okay? It really has been around for ever, 50 years, yes. It's very similar to teletype, yes. Yeah, it's very similar to the teletype system. Teletype used dedicated lines for that. It could also run on, not on the Titanic. They had a spark gap transmitter on the Titanic, and they were doing Morse code. But teletype is it's been around for a long time too. They use that. The military used it a lot, and I know we used it in the missile field a lot. So interesting stuff there.
Radio stations used to.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's funny how some of these old technologies stick around because they continue to work, and they're not breaking enough that it's worth it to replace them, right? So you'll find that some of these old technologies, like packet radio, people started playing with that in the 80s and they were having a blast with it. And then it kind of faded away for a while. And now it's kind of coming back. Same thing with APRS. Slow scan TV is making a comeback. All of these things are like, people are like, wow, it was really cool that we could do that. I wonder if it still works. Yeah, it still works. So it's very interesting. You'll hear about FT8 and JS8. These are modes that they encode in the information in very efficient ways and in very robust ways. And so sometimes you can get a signal through on, for example, FT8 or JS8 that you would not be able to get on RTTY, for example, because the signal is too noisy for RTTY. They will actually successfully get a signal through on those other modes that definitely there's no way you could get a voice signal through. You could probably get a CW signal through, but there's no way you would get a voice signal through. But JS8 and FT8 will do just fine. They'll actually pull it off. You'll also hear about some phase shift keying modes like PSK31. There's a few different variants of that. The 31 indicates that it's 31 bits in essentially a packet, and it uses an encoding to try to make that more robust and be able to get the information through. You'll also hear about things like PACTOR and AMTOR. Those are mechanisms that were developed to change the analog data into, or the digital data into analog data to go out on the radio and back again. And then the new kid on the block is VARA, and VARA also uses a spread spectrum type technology where it's encoding like 4 different streams on a single audio signal that are picked apart on the other side and decoded. And you can get pretty decent bandwidth through that type of system. So you'll hear about all of those. Another one you'll hear commonly is bandwidth. I just used it in regards with VARA, for example. With VARA, it used to be we couldn't run VARA at full speed because the FCC rule said you can't do more than 300 baud on HF. And 300 baud is 300 bits per second. And VARA was capable of going faster than that, but because of the rule, we weren't allowed to. Same thing with Pactor 4. We weren't able to use that here in the US because it was too fast. They recently changed that. I say recently, it's probably been a couple of years now. They changed that and changed it to a bandwidth restriction and said, you can't use more than this much of the band for your signal, but you can do whatever you want within that band, within that amount of bandwidth. The bandwidth is essentially how much around your particular frequency that you're on, you're actually utilizing. Okay. And I think Stan said earlier, like FM on the ham bands, we use what we call wide FM, and it's 5 kilohertz wide. Broadcast FM uses 15 kilohertz wide. And you'll also hear about narrow FM, which I think uses like what, 2.5. And around here, all of the repeaters are going to be on what we call wide FM. They're all going to be on this 5 kilohertz spacing. And so if you hear somebody and their radio is set to narrow FM, you'll notice because they'll be really quiet. And you'll just be blowing their doors off when you talk. Because again, the volume relates to how that signal is modulated, right? So you need to make sure that you're always using regular FM or wide FM, which is the 5 kilohertz wide. You'll hear about power and gain. Power is the amount of energy in the signal, and gain is a measurement of how well that power is being directed, essentially. So if you have a particular type of antenna, it might be, what's the gain on a typical Yagi antenna, Dan? 7 dB, right? So you're getting what, 3 dB is 2 times, right? Or it's 10 times.
No, 3
dB is
100%.
So it's 2 times. So 2 times. So you're getting 4 times the power essentially from just from the antenna, from the amount of power that you're putting into it versus the amount that's actually coming out. But in order to do that, you're focusing your signal. And so other parts of other directions aren't receiving your signal as much, right? So those are things to consider. And you'll hear about these different antenna types. You'll hear about your vertical antenna, which is basically just a vertical pole. You'll hear about a beam antenna. Beam and a beam is like it's like a Yagi, but it's kind of a degradation of a Yagi, right? It's got only a single transmitting element and a single focusing element, where a Yagi might have 10 focusing elements and 1 reflecting element in the back. So there are different antenna types that have different purposes. What do you?
I mean, I got a 20-meter beam that has a reflector and a director and a.
Yeah, but when you see like you're driving down the street and you see some guy's antenna on the roof and it's like an H shape, that's your typical beam antenna. Okay. So at least that's what I call it. I mean, obviously a Yagi is a beam antenna. Okay. But the basic factor is that antenna is aimed. And so quite often you'll see that they have a rotator on that so they can turn that antenna and point it in the direction that they want to send their signal or receive from. Stan.
Comment, in this area here, everything's up and down, north and south. And so KSL, 50,000 watts. Well, the other stations want to compete with KSL. So what they do is they put up 2 antennas in directions, their antennas north and south. So all their power goes north and south. It's like the CP radios on semi trucks, hang them out there in the mirrors. So all their power goes behind and everything.
Yeah, so Stan is pointing out that depending on your arrangement of your antennas, you can actually be directing most of your power in a particular direction. And so with like the TV broadcasters or the AM radio broadcasters, they will actually do that and have multiple antennas that direct the signal up and down the valley, because our valley mostly runs north and south. And so they can, with less power input, they can get a stronger signal up and down the valley. They trade away that signal on the sides, but since there's nothing there but mountains, it's not that big of a deal for them. Damn.
So let's put it in practical terms. The Murray Amateur Radio Club's antenna on the tower will describe power and gain perfectly. It's a regular vertical antenna, but it's up almost 200 feet in the air. And it's on a 7.5 dBi gain antenna. So the transmitter down 200 feet on the ground is only pushing 40 watts, okay? But because of the gain and the height, the effective radiated power is 300 and something watts. So it goes from 40 watts to 360 watts, just because of the gain.
Because of the antenna.
Because of the antenna, because of the coax that we use. So yeah, when you have gain on an antenna and height, that produces a different effective radiated power value than what your transmitter is actually doing.
And of course, the corresponding factor to gain is loss. Barb, you had a question.
So it said that if you made it too high and too much power to blow out like the transmitter and the receiver, you know. So you can't go over 300, right?
No. There's lots involved with creating a repeater. Okay, there's lots of different elements that make up a repeater. Okay, a repeater, especially when you're at like the KSL towers or Inside Peak, where you have 50 antennas that are transmitting hundreds of watts, or it could be thousands of watts. Well, each antenna doesn't want to listen to the other antenna, right? And so there's mechanisms in the repeater shaft that does that. There's filters, okay? So yeah, there's no chance.
After the meeting, I'll talk to you about it. I can show you pictures of our repeater and how it's set up, and that we can explain it, but I want to move on. So, but yeah, so lots of different antenna types. Other ones on here, loop antennas. They're basically a circular antenna shape. Interesting thing about that is, depending on how much power you're using, the direction of the signal may be through the middle of the loop, or it may be along the sides of the loop. It just depends on the nature of the power that you're putting through there. So you've got to consider that. It just kind of depends on the shape of the antenna and the frequencies that you're using and the amount of power that you're putting into it, right? So those all go together to combine to make the particular pattern that antenna is going to produce. And there's a whole system around that, and there are things called Smith charts, and it's way out of scope of this lesson. So, but there's tons of stuff about antennas that you can work on and learn about and understand. And to me, it's kind of like a black art, right? I mean, it's I look at an antenna and I talk to guys and they're like, oh yeah, my antenna is my rain gutter, because I live in an HOA and I can't put an antenna on my roof, but nobody can complain that I have a rain gutter. So I just have my transmitter connected to my rain gutter, and I have a good matching array in front of it, an antenna tuner in front of it, and I'm able to get my signal out and get my signal in. So, it's like, how does that even work? Your rain gutter is like some crazy odd measurement, and it's like magic. How does that actually function? But it works. It doesn't work well, but it works well enough to do what they want to do, right? Which is, they don't have any other way to put a better antenna up, and that's the best they've got. So they're going to go with it. I've also seen amazing antenna arrays. The remote base setup at Levan, oh my gosh, the antenna setup that they have down there is amazing. And it's, you can reach out and touch people on the other side of the planet with that thing. And without using a lot of power. And so it's all pretty
I was
amazing.
talking to Lithuania before class in my truck with my antenna there. It does, if you get a resonant antenna or an antenna that likes the frequency that you're transmitting on, if you can, that's called resonance, right? If you can match that, then depending on what the band.
You can get
conditions are,
amazing,
all over the place.
you can
Yeah.
get amazing signals. Yeah, we're not going to go into that tonight. So, dipole is another antenna type. It's basically just a wire, right? So like the rain gutter is essentially a dipole, if it's insulated. And then NVIS is an interesting antenna type that I found out a little while ago, and Dan used it very effectively during the Pony Express recreation. And what it does is NVIS stands for Near Vertical Incident Skywave. And so normally when you set up your antenna, you're sending a signal out horizontally, and it's going out and it's bouncing off the ionosphere and it's coming back down to the earth somewhere far away. With NVIS, you're sending the signal almost straight up. And so it comes almost straight back down again. And you're getting maybe 150, 250 miles of range out of it, which is perfect if the people you want to talk to are 150 miles away or 250 miles away. It's not great if the person you want to talk to is 5,000 miles away, but you don't use that antenna when you're talking to that person. You use a different antenna, right? So just some amazing antenna technology. There's so much to learn about antennas. We really need to do an advanced class just on antennas and talk about all the different ways that antennas work and how to simulate them and how to figure out what they're going to do and all of that stuff. But I don't know enough to teach that class. So maybe one of you guys who's been a radio operator in the military can teach a class like that for us, but we'll see. Anyway, okay. One other thing that we're going to talk about is the phonetic alphabet. Okay, we typically in amateur radio we use the NATO alphabet, and this alphabet was agreed upon by the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union. All of the countries that are signatories to the ITU agree to use the NATO alphabet. And the NATO alphabet was created specifically so that it would be easy to use, understand, and be heard and understood by people with different accents and different native languages. Okay? Because I know if you've ever talked to a French person who has a strong French accent, they will pronounce things differently from the way that I pronounce them, for example, or a German speaking person will pronounce things differently, or a Spanish speaking person will pronounce things differently. Even if they're saying the same words, it's going to sound different. And that's why we use this NATO alphabet, because the words are designed to be distinctive enough, regardless of the language, the accent, or the intonation of the person speaking. I have the alphabet here, and yes, I did fix it so it says India, not indigo. And I also noted some common punctuation characters that you may say in as you're speaking. And so typically you're going to use this if you're spelling something, right? So you want to get a specific word transmitted correctly, whatever that word might be, whatever it's for, that's immaterial. We don't, a lot of times when we're asked to pass a message, we don't care what's in the message. Our job is to take the messages that they gave us and make sure that the same message comes off the other end and gets delivered to the person it's going to, right? So sometimes you're going to be handed a list of words or a list of abbreviations, and you're going to look at it and be like, I have no idea what any of this means, but Alpha, Charlie, Delta, Quebec, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the message that the other guy is copying down, and that's the message that gets delivered. And as long as you do that correctly, it will get through, okay? And so stop, dot, decimal period, those would be the period character, depending on how you're using it, right? If you're using it in a number and it's a decimal point in the number, you're going to say decimal. You generally do not use the comma for place value separation when you're giving a number over the air. You just give the number, okay? Some different languages use the dot where we would use the comma and the comma where we would use the dot. But if you say decimal, that means the decimal point. Whether it's a comma for them or a period, you don't care. It's the decimal point, okay? So keep that in mind. Hyphen or dash are exchangeable. The one that gets people is the slash character. And working in computers, I run into people all the time that are like, well, backslash, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, 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 no. That's not a backslash. That's a slash. This is a backslash. If I want you to type a backslash, I will say backslash. Do not type that if I don't say that. Use a forward slash. We will use stroke or slant to replace the slash because it's not, it's less ambiguous, right? Most people.
Want to escape the slash, then do that.
Backslash slash, right? Yes, exactly. Yes. And then colon, semicolon, exclamation, all those are fairly common. One thing that I like to draw attention to is parentheses, brackets, and braces. Okay. And a lot of people confuse these. And so if you're trying to be very adamant about getting a particular message across, you want to use the right terminology. Parentheses are the curvy ones. Brackets are the square ones. And sometimes you'll even say square brackets. And then the ones that are like squiggly shaped are braces, or you'll hear them called squiggly brackets sometimes. But if you say braces, then people know which ones you're talking about. And you'll say like open paren, open bracket, open or close paren, close bracket, etc. Right? And that helps you determine what you're actually talking about when they're copying it. Justin, go ahead.
Oh, just so regarding your warning about cutesy words, I hear people saying kilowatt instead of kilo all the time.
Yes,
Is
I
that
hate that.
or is that okay because it's radio?
I hate that. The problem is when they say kilowatt, are they talking about K or are they talking about KW? I don't know.
Yeah,
Right? It's an ambiguous
yeah.
statement, an ambiguous word, and we want to avoid ambiguity. So if you are saying K, you want to say kilo, and if you're saying W, you want to say whiskey. You don't want to say kilowatt because somebody will get confused and they will write the wrong thing down. We have a member of the club who is famous for using kilowatt.
Kilowatt America.
And I hate that. It just drives me crazy every time I hear it on the radio. Now, if you want to take your call sign and make something cute out of it, like we have Travis in the club, his call sign is KF7 KFC. And so he's like, oh, it's KFC, like Kentucky Fried Chicken. That's fine if you want to do that. But when you're actually giving it to me in phonetics, give it to me in phonetics. Don't use the cutesy words. Don't say Kentucky Fried Chicken. Say Kilo Foxtrot Charlie, and then I will know what you're talking about.
Because the only thing that will do is get
I
you
did
hungry.
that once.
Right?
I did that once. Everybody beginning of all. I didn't know.
Anyway, so
Said.
and Z or Z. That's another one. I'll say Z when I give my call sign. Why do I do that? I don't know. It doesn't sound like C. It definitely does not sound like C, so it's distinguishable in that regard. But I was born in England, so I will say Z because
That's how I say Z.
my mom taught me to say Z, right? So I'll use Z, but some people will say Z. But I'll always use Zulu if I'm spelling it phonetically. Always. It'll be Kilo Delta 7 Zulu Whiskey Victor. I will never say what would be I don't even know what a good fake up one would be. If you go on the website, yeah, right. Yeah, something dumb, right? I mean, people will do that though. People will do that because they think it's cool, and it's not cool. Don't do it. So
Sometimes people still can't hear when you're giving your call sign. And especially on HF, if you give your call sign with the proper phonetics and they keep asking.
Sometimes it helps to use a
then
different word.
sometimes
Yeah.
Use an alternate.
Yeah.
Sierra. That's not a good one.
Kilowatt. No, that's not a good one.
Oscar or Ocean,
Yeah.
Quebec, Queen.
Yeah. So sometimes
But that's only in.
if they're not getting it, right? Yeah. If they're not getting it. Jeff, you have a comment?
I've also heard that, I don't have any experience here, but I've heard that sometimes in contesting, you can say something cutesy that will get the attention
Of the other station. Yeah.
Yes.
That's true.
Yeah. Sometimes in contesting, saying something cutesy will get their attention and get them to come back to you instead of somebody else. I still don't think you should do it. I
They
think
use it as a differentiator, and I hear it all the time.
if you do it, if you do it, you're making a bad habit out of it, and then you'll do it sometime when it's really important to not do it, and people will get confused and bad things could happen.
Well, I think it's important that you use the proper phonetics
First,
and try it a couple times. And if you can't break through a pile-up, well, then if you're gonna use the cutesy term, but you're still going with your proper.
true, very
call
true,
sign.
very true. Okay, so enough on that. I do have a page on the website called the Phonetic Alphabet, and it has a version of the phonetic alphabet that is terrible. For example, I is in I, right? So, things like that. Just it's a funny joke. Don't use it in real life, right? Okay. Code words and phrases. So, in general, secret codes are not allowed, right? You can't use a secret code or a cipher. But publicly understood codes are commonly used. And so they generally fit into two different categories. You have your Q signals and your prosigns. And the Q signals are typically 3-letter codes that start with the letter Q, hence Q signals. And these came from the old telegraph days, okay? And they're still used today. QTH is your home address, where you're at home, right? QSO is a conversation on the radio. And so you'll hear people say, oh, I had a great QSO with so-and-so the other, or QSO, you'll hear they say. They'll abbreviate it to QSO with so-and-so the other day. They're talking about a conversation they had on the radio. QSY is I want to change frequency, or I just changed frequency, or I'm changing frequency and I want you to change frequency also. So you might use that if you're on a simplex or on a repeater and you realize that you can hear the other person on the input. So you want to switch to a simplex frequency to save the repeater, so you're not hogging up the repeater when you don't need to. You tell the other person, oh, I can hear you on the input, QSY to such and such a frequency, and you'll switch over, both of you will switch over to that and talk on simplex, okay? So you'll hear that sometimes. QRM is noise, and there's actually two that mean noise. There's QRM and QRN. QRM is natural noise, or just like noise from the environment. QRN is man-made noise, like if you have your radio in your vehicle and the ignition system is ticking away and you hear that every time you transmit, or a big whine or something like that, that would be QRN. Go
Are
ahead.
you saying Romeo Mike or Romeo November?
Exactly.
So Romeo Mike is the cat, Romeo November is natural.
No.
No, it's the other way around.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
Romeo Mike is natural. Romeo November is man-made. Yes, don't ask. This is how it was 100 years ago when they were doing this on wires, right? So, but QRM, you'll hear QRZ is basically, who is this, right? And you'll typically hear that in regards to people will say, oh, go on QRZ and look me up. And there's a website called QRZ.com that has a lot of people's call signs programmed into it. And you can go there and search for a call sign and find their information, okay? QSL basically means this is going to everybody, right? Is that no, the other way. QSL is the frequency in use. No.
QSL is,
Confirmed.
did
Did you copy me? QSL is did you copy me correctly? Or you're
depends on
waving,
context.
you got a question, Sam.
Yeah, looking up here, checking a couple of different sites here online, and they do say that QRM is, Mike is man-made.
Really?
Yeah, QRM.
I've always used it the other way around.
So just double check with two different sites, and they're both.
Well,
both same.
maybe I'm wrong on that, Chris. Maybe you are correct. So, I will look that up and I will have that for you next month. So, I'll find out for sure. But to me, it's always been the other way around. So I don't know. We'll figure it out. But, yeah, I'd like to be correct in what I teach. So, we'll definitely do that. And, so QSL, I always use like QSL as like, is the frequency and use type of a thing. You're
If I'm
saying,
sending a message, if I'm saying.
you're gonna ask me QSL,
QSL.
did I copy it? Okay. I have heard it used that way, yes. QST maybe is the one I'm thinking of, where you're checking to see if the frequency's in
No,
use. No?
QSD is you have a general message.
Okay. I'm way off on this. Obviously, I'm not an HF operator. I'm not general class, so I hardly ever use these, right? I'll use QTH, I'll use QSO, I'll use QSY. Those are the main ones that I'll use, okay, as a technician class. So I need to look those up again and get those into my brain. Prosigns is a different type of thing. They're typically 2 letters or 2 digits, and they're codes that were originally used on the telegraph, right? And they're used to replace common expressions. And so some of them you will encounter are, people will say to you 73, and 73 means best regards. Now you will hear people say 73s, and what they're saying to you is best regards is something. Yeah. So don't say 73s, just say 73 or 73, and people will understand what you're talking about. 88 is similar. It's hugs and kisses. Probably best to use that with your YL or XYL, which is the next one. YL is young lady. So my young lady is my wife. She's no longer my YL. She's my XYL. She's still my wife, but she's not young anymore.
You're gonna get in trouble if you send. Let me tell you.
If I send 88 to a YL, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
In the 70s, it was common on the radio to say 3s and 8s.
3s and 8s.
Yeah,
And what is that?
73 and 88.
Nice. 3s and
Okay.
8s is 73 and 88.
But
Okay.
the political climate has changed since then. And so it's no longer.
It's no longer
proper to say that.
accepted to say that. Okay. So yeah, your YL, or I've heard YM used as well for a young man, a woman operator talking about her young man. And your XYL would be your ex-girlfriend or boyfriend, your current spouse, right? And then OM is a general term for the typical ham. OM stands for old man. And we're all old men, so we use OM. You'll hear hi, which in Morse code it sounds like it sounds like somebody laughing, and so that's what you'll say for laughter, to be disambiguous. And so you'll actually hear that on the repeater. Somebody will say hi, and they're just laughing about it. They rather than just laughing on the microphone.
It's like saying LOL.
Yeah, it's like saying LOL.
It's for ha-ha.
It's ham for haha, exactly. And then SK, fortunately, we haven't had to use that one too much in the club. We've only had one SK in the club. So SK stands for silent key, and that indicates that you're talking about an operator who has passed away. They're no longer with us. SK is also used as an end of message indicator in message passing, which is kind of annoying because I would rather have it only have one meaning. And I kind of like silent key versus end of message. I think
Well, like all of this stuff, it depends on.
depends on context, right? Dave is our silent key club member. He passed away a couple of years ago. So far we've only lost one ham, and that's pretty good. And then DX is used for talking about long distance communications. Distance transceiving, X somehow becomes transceiver. I don't know, but You'll hear it as Xceiver sometimes, as a transceiver as an Xceiver. So DX is long range communications. Those are common ones that you hear. I was doing DX last night with somebody in uh, Zimbabwe or whatever, right? So obviously it's a long distance communications. Did I skip CQ? I was in there. CQ. CQ is the general call, right? If I'm calling somebody and I don't know who's out there, I'm going to call CQ. Basically, it means, hey, anybody, come back to me, right? We'll talk a little bit more about CQ in a second in regards to talking on repeaters, but yeah, so that CQ is basically calling anybody. One thing about ham radio, we don't broadcast, we transmit. And all of our signals are supposed to be directed to somebody. Well, if you don't know who's out there for you to talk to, you still have to direct your signal to somebody. So you call CQ, which is anybody, and that anyone can respond to that, right? If I wanted to call Dan specifically, I would say N7XDL, this is KD7ZWV. And then Dan would know I'm calling him and he would come back to me. But if I'm calling anybody, I would say CQ from KD7ZWV. And now I've ID'd my call and I've called out to anybody and anybody could respond. I'm happy to talk to anybody, right? I don't need to talk to one specific person.
We covered this, but some of these terms are more commonly used
In HF, correct,
but not used on repeater.
correct. All right, we got a bit to go here, so let's see how fast we can hustle through this. Okay, so you will hear things on the radio that you are not familiar with or that you don't understand. Well, they may be terms that are specific to radio, or they may be terms that are specific to some other area of interest of the operator who's talking. If you don't know what they're talking about, ask them. Remember, amateur radio is about talking to people. So if somebody is talking about the latest and greatest Frobnitz that they were playing with last night, and you don't know what a Frobnitz is, hey, what the heck is a Frobnitz? Oh, well, that's the little gizmo that goes between the doohickey and the doojigger, right? Oh, well, that solves my problem, you know. But then you can ask, what's the doohickey and the doojigger? And you go from there, right? So now you have a conversation. If you don't know, ask. Don't feel stupid. There are no stupid questions. I know everybody says that. It's always kind of trite. Oh, yeah, there's no stupid questions except the one I'm going to ask. But no, there's no stupid questions. If you don't know something, the only way you're going to find out is if you ask, okay? And so you can either live in ignorance or you can ask the question and learn something. I would highly recommend learning something at any given opportunity. All right. What language do we not use in amateur radio? Okay. If you came from CB radio or police radio, public service radio, you're probably familiar with the concept of 10 codes, like 10-4, 10-9, you know, what's your location? What's your 10-9, you know? We don't use 10 codes in amateur radio.
What's your repeat?
Yeah. 10-20. 10-9 is I didn't get that, right? Yeah. So yeah, 10-20 is your 20. What's your 20 is your location, right? So you'll hear 10-4. You'll hear 10-4 sometimes, but in general, we avoid using 10 codes, mainly because we don't want to sound like a bunch of CB operators, right? We generally avoid using that. No secret codes or ciphers. Not only does it violate the spirit of amateur radio, it's illegal to do that. We are not allowed to use secret codes or ciphers or encryption of any kind on amateur radio frequencies.
Which are marketed on ham radios.
Yes, you will find ham radios that are sold that say it has encryption capability. Don't turn that on because that's not legal to do, okay? So just keep that in mind. Shorthand and other code words other than the ones that we've talked about, we try to use clear English whenever possible, because if you're using clear English, people will understand what you're talking about. If you're throwing around a bunch of crazy acronyms and things like that, they may not know what you're talking about. And the goal is to communicate with people, not to exhibit your superiority to them, right? So try to use clear English whenever possible. And we don't use made up handles instead of our names. We use our names on amateur radio, and we're all friends. So we're all on a first name basis with each other. So we always use our first name and our call sign. In fact, you'll hardly ever hear anybody give their last name on the radio. Dan, you had a comment.
Although you will hear people ask you what's your handle, and
They're not asking for, oh, I'm Spyman or whatever. Your handle is your name.
my CB handle was laser.
Yeah.
I don't use that.
You
on
don't use that on amateur
handle.
radio, yeah.
Yes, my handle is Dan.
Yeah, so, yes, Sam, go ahead.
I guess that, and kind of an exception to that are tactical.
Tactical call signs.
That's the exception.
I won't talk about tactical call signs tonight, but
But that's still not a handle.
I do have a presentation on tactical call signs on the website that if you're interested, you can look that up. Go to the website and search for tactical and you'll find it. But yeah, so there is that factor that tactical call signs are not your call sign and they're not your name, but they reflect the position that you're serving in for a given operation. So for example, when I'm at a bike race and I'm a operator at a aid station, my tactical call sign will be the location of my aid station, typically. And so if there happen to be 2 or 3 operators at that aid station, all of them will use the same tactical call sign. You also have to use your real call sign to ID at the end of your transmission, just like you normally would. Okay. So it's not a replacement to your real call sign. It's in addition to your real call sign. All right. We got to hustle through these last few pages. All right. So what do I say? You're about to talk on the radio. What are you going to say? If you're joining a net, follow the example of the other operators on the net. You'll be asked to identify with your name or your call sign, where you're at, possibly some other information. A lot of times they'll ask for your location. The Crossroads net will ask what elementary school you're closest to. That's one of the things that they like to keep track of when people check into their net. So just do what the other operators on the net are doing and you'll be fine. If you're on a quiet frequency and you're just trying to see if anybody's out there, try saying CQ or on a repeater. A lot of people will get uptight if you say CQ on a repeater. Why? I do not know. I will still say CQ on a repeater, but some people do get upset about that and they think you should just say your call sign. You can just say your call sign and that indicates that you're out there. Okay.
You can say your call sign anyway.
You can say your call. You're going to say your call sign after you say CQ anyway, right? You're not just going to key up and say CQ. You're going to say CQ from my call sign. Yeah, some people will get uptight if you say CQ. You'll hear people say their call sign followed by the word monitoring or listening. And I've always felt like, well, that's nice that you're listening. Obviously, you don't want to talk to me or you would have said that you're wanting to talk, right? You're just going to sit there and listen. I don't know why you're even transmitting, but what they're doing is just getting their call sign out there and they're saying, hey, I'm out here. I'm willing to talk if you want to talk. So that's usually. Sometimes they just want to listen. I don't know why they say anything. Just turn the radio on and listen. But people are people. So if you're breaking into an existing QSO in between the calls, so somebody will be talking and then they'll stop talking and the next person will start talking. In between their talking, say your call sign. Key up, say your call sign and unkey. And one or the other of them will hear you. If the one who's about to talk doesn't hear you because he's already keyed up, the other one will hear some noise and he'll know that there was a double. And so he'll come back and say, there was a double. Whoever was trying to break in, go ahead. That's you. And then you say your call sign and then you're joining the conversation. You go on from there. If you do join an existing conversation, follow the pattern of that conversation. It might be a round robin. It might be a star type communication where one person is acting as the hub and everybody's talking to them. That's usually less common than the round robin where you just go around the circle. I've been in round robins with 5 or 6 people, and it can be kind of confusing remembering who you were talking to and what the last thing they said was when it's your turn to talk finally. And so it's a bit of an adventure to get your brain working around that. Sometimes it takes more concentration than you thought it would. Let's see if, okay, next one is, what if it's an emergency? You've got emergency traffic. Your calls will take priority if you've got an emergency, okay? So break in, if you hear an existing conversation on the radio, when first person stops talking, key up and say, break, break, break. And that is indicating, hey, I need to talk right now. Okay. Even if they only hear one of those breaks, one of them will hear that and they will get to you. Okay. So get your keyword out there. Break is very fast to say, very short. It's not the length of your call sign. So you can get that out there in a hurry. Okay. When they acknowledge you, give your call sign and state that you have emergency traffic, and those operators will typically drop everything to help you in whatever way they possibly can. They may need to relay your transmission to a 911 operator or something like that, or they may need to relay it to another operator who can relay it to a 911 operator. Sometimes you're in a place where you can't actually get to a person who has cell phone service, for example. This happens in Logan Canyon. You hear about it all the time. A car ends up in the river, and some amateur radio operator driving by calls in to the repeater and gets somebody that is sitting at home listening. They come on and make the phone call to 911 and relay the information back and forth. Main thing, don't panic. If you're in an emergency situation like this and you're the communications person, don't panic. The people already having the emergency, they're panicking enough for everybody. Okay. Barb. Right. Yeah. Know where you are. That's important. If you can give them a mile marker number and a particular road, that will be very helpful to the emergency services people. Or even if you're approximately 3 miles north of whatever intersection or something like that, that is much better than I'm on this road. You know, in that regard, though, I'm on this road is better than I'm out here, right? I don't know where I'm at. If you've got what 3 words on your phone, use that and give them the what 3 words. If you've got a GPS, give them the GPS coordinate. They can find you that way. Chris.
So real quick on that, despite what Hollywood says, the very first question the 911 operator will ask you is, what is your location? They will ask you, and even if you tell it to them, and it shows up on our screens, they'll still ask you, please verify your location, and then they'll verify your callback.
Yeah.
But yeah, the location, most 911 operators also know, like, local landmarks, so like, hey, I'm about a mile up the trail from Bridal Falls.
Right. They'll know where that is approximately. They'll have an idea at least. A good enough idea to get help to you. Barb.
Mr. Driver, Canada's transportation, and then dispatch would say, like, give me your ETA, and I would tell them on the radio phone, I'm on highway, Interstate 80 heading east at, exit something. You know, because my transmission went out on the van, so I had to tell them exactly where the transmission was.
Right. Yeah. So knowing where you are, if you are driving along and you see those mile marker signs go by, just try to keep in the back of your mind, what's the last one you saw, right? And on the interstate, the exit numbers will be the same as the mile marker number on the interstate. On a regular road, highway or something like that out in the boonies, the mile markers will typically go from a particular intersection to wherever that road ends, right? Maybe another intersection, or when that road just ends, the mile markers will follow that road. So if you've got an idea of what the mile marker is, it's much easier for them to find you. If you're having the emergency, go ahead and say Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is KD7ZWV. I need help. Anybody out there, come back to me now. And if you don't hear anything, try another frequency. Do it again. Eventually, you'll find something where somebody is. Okay. Go ahead and start your call, even if the frequency is quiet. Make that initial call and say, "Hey, I've got an emergency. I've got emergency traffic," and someone quite often is monitoring. They're not going to normally talk to anybody, but if they hear you've got emergency traffic, they'll talk to you. Okay. So in the same regard, Don't say you have emergency traffic if you don't really have emergency traffic and you just want somebody to talk to. Yes, I have emergency traffic. I'm really tired and I need somebody to talk to so I don't fall asleep on my way home tonight. No, that's not an emergency. Okay.
I'd much rather have that though than.
I would rather have, hey, this is KD7 ZWV. I'm driving down I-15 and I'm super tired. Somebody please talk to me.
Yeah, that's.
That's not an emergency.
Maydays.
That's not an emergency, but somebody will probably come back to you and talk to you, especially if you're on the Farnsworth peak repeater. Somebody's always on that repeater. People are always monitoring the 6.2. Okay. The main thing I want you to remember when you're talking on the radio is we were all beginners. Okay. Every one of us made our first radio call. Every one of us had that same feeling of, I'm going to push this button and dozens of people that I don't know are going to hear my voice. And what am I going to say? I'm going to sound like a dum-dum, right? You will make mistakes. Just go with it. You just have to just go with it. I learned this. It was, I used to play the organ, and my organ instructor played for the First Presbyterian Church in Great Falls, Montana. They had a beautiful pipe organ, and she took me down there to try it out and actually experience playing on a pipe organ. If you've never played on a pipe organ, it is a really amazing experience because a pipe organ is actually a living, breathing thing. It's not just a machine. There's air moving through it all the time. You'll feel as you push on the pedal, you'll feel the shutters opening and closing and hear the shutters opening and closing on the pipe rooms. And you feel this presence with that machine. And when you start playing, you will notice that where you are playing, you don't hear that right away. You won't hear it for a good quarter, half a second after you've played the note and moved on to the next one. And so when you make a mistake, which you will do because we all make mistakes, when you make a mistake, you can't stop and go back. It's too late for that. Just run with it. Just keep going. The people aren't going to care that you made a mistake. Okay. Same thing with amateur radio. You're gonna make a mistake. Just go with it. Oh, I didn't mean that. I meant this. I've heard people give their call sign wrong. And then they're like, oh my God, I gave my call sign wrong. Now I've really messed up. I broke the law, No, just say, oh, sorry, I meant this, not that, And people on the radio will be like, okay, I did that, And it's not that big of a deal. You're going to make mistakes. No one is going to give you a report card at the end of your QSO.
I have that reaction to get my call sign right with this new call.
Yeah. I said it correctly. Yes. Yeah. So, if you're not sure what to talk about, you can talk about anything. Talk about what kind of radio you have. Talk about your antenna. Talk about what your audio sounds like. You can't hear yourself talk on the radio. So you have to have other people tell you, oh, you sound like crap, or you're really overdriving it. Move back from the mic a little bit or something like that. You won't know that yourself unless somebody tells you. And if you hear somebody and they sound terrible, go ahead and tell them, hey, I can't quite make out what you're saying. Maybe back off on the mic a little bit and I'll be able to hear you better. Or use more power and maybe you'll get through the noise a little bit better. Or, move to a different location. Make sure your antenna is pointing straight up and down. Those are all things that go into it, right? So keep those things in mind as you're talking on the radio. Also, you can talk about any other hobby that you're interested in. I've heard people talking on the 6.2 driving to work, and they're talking about photography. And I'm moderately interested in photography, but I'm not a photographer. But you can have a great conversation about taking pictures of birds, and not have to be a photographer to get something out of it. So there's always something to talk about. Mic fright is a real thing. Solutions for mic fright: make yourself a cheat sheet or a script. Write down your call sign, write down your location, write down what type of radio you've got. And so when somebody says, oh, what kind of radio are you using? I'm using a Kenwood THD 72. Yeah, that's what I'm using. I don't have to look at my radio and where the heck does it say the model number on here? Have it written down so you're ready to respond to that question. And take notes on what other people are saying. So a lot of people like to copy down the call signs of everybody that they talk to. And in fact, it used to be a requirement to maintain a logbook of everybody that you talk to. That's not a requirement anymore, but a lot of people are still in the habit of doing that. It's more on HF. You'll find people keeping logs better on HF than they do on VHF. VHF is more for just chatting with people as opposed to specific directed communications and stuff like that. But if you write down things, it will help you. And I know with the phonetics, Dan does this when he's driving along on the road. He'll see a license plate and read it out loud in phonetics, just to get his brain thinking of the actual phonetics for those letters and numbers, right? So that you program your brain to see the letter and hear the phonetic in your head. So just different things that you can do. You'll also quickly be able to recognize certain operators. There are certain operators that you will hear on the radio a lot, and they have very distinctive voices, or they talk about very distinctive things. My first QSO was with a guy named David, KD7UUF, and if I hear him on the radio, I know that's David anytime I hear him on the radio. I have actually met him in person. It only took 25 years before I met him in person, but I have actually met him in person. Nice guy. But he has a very distinctive voice, and he's usually half asleep when I'm talking to him on the radio. So I recognize that, and I know it's him when I hear him. He used to talk a lot about metal detecting. He used to be really into metal detecting, and he used to go out and do metal detecting all the time. And he doesn't do too much of that anymore, but that was something that we could always talk about, because I don't do that, but I'm interested in it. It's interesting enough to talk about. So there's always something to talk about. Get on a net, participate on the nets. Our weekly net is a great place to start. In fact, you already know some of the people who are going to be on the net because they're sitting in the room tonight, right? So hop on our net on Sunday and talk with us. All right. And then I have some links on here to previous classes that go on these same topics, that if you're wanting to get more information, you can dive into these. I did want to add one thing. Last month, I was talking about CTCSS tones and why you don't use them on simplex. And I had a guy come back to my YouTube posting of the class, and he said there's one time when you do want to consider using a CTCSS tone, and that's if you're running your radio in crossband repeat mode. You may want to set a CTCSS tone on your radio so that not anybody is activating your crossband repeater. Only you are activating it. And so I did want to mention that. That was a case that I hadn't considered. I've got a class on crossband repeat, and I hadn't considered that. But it was a good point that he made, and he's an operator out of Canada, I think. And we talked back and forth a little bit about that topic, and it was like, yeah, that's about the only time I would consider using a CTCSS tone on a simplex frequency. But anyway, that's all I have. I'm going to wrap it up. We're running a little bit late, but thanks everybody for your time. Any questions that want to go on the recording, throw them out now, and we'll get them on the recording. Otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording. Any questions, comments? Nothing heard. I will stop the recording.